Imagine you are an archaeologist,
Mhm.
or maybe just a railway engineer, right? Working out in the Punjab region.
Right, and it is blistering hot out there.
Exactly. It's the year 1921. You're out there under the British colonial administration, and your entire job is just to lay down tracks for a new railway line.
Which requires a lot of materials.
Yeah, you need ballast. You need these sturdy, hard materials to pack under the wooden ties so you can form the foundation of these tracks.
Yeah.
And someone points out this massive dusty mound in the distance.
Near a village called Harappa, actually.
Yeah, Harappa. And you go over there and you find that it's just absolutely packed with millions of perfectly baked, high-quality bricks.
Just sitting there in the dirt.
Right. So to the laborers, I mean, this is a jackpot. It's free, pre-made building material.
They don't have to manufacture anything.
Exactly. So they start hauling these bricks away by the thousands. They're grinding them up, packing them under the iron rails. They have absolutely no idea that they are literally dismantling the ruins of a lost world.
It's wild to think about.
It is. They are taking the foundation of a 5,500-year-old metropolis, a city that had indoor plumbing, while most of Europe was still living in, like, rudimentary huts, and they're turning it into train tracks.
And nobody stopped them for a while?
No. It isn't until an Indian archaeologist named Dayaram Sani steps onto the site, looks at these strange carved seals being pulled from the dirt, and basically yells for everyone to stop, that the world realizes what is actually buried there.
It is genuinely one of the most heart-stopping moments in the history of archaeology.
Oh, for sure.
You have modern industry literally crushing ancient history under its wheels until someone finally recognizes the sheer scale of the architecture. And, that story perfectly encapsulates what we're doing today.
Exactly.
We're going on a deep dive into a comprehensive overview of ancient India, tracing the journey of the subcontinent from its literal geological formation through that mind-blowing Indus Valley Civilization into the Vedic era, the Epic Age, and finally, the intellectual revolutions of Buddhism and Jainism.
And we aren't just, reciting a timeline here.
No, not at all.
We are looking at the foundational architecture of human thought. We're exploring how geography, early urban planning, and some of the most rigorous philosophical inquiries ever made in antiquity are still intimately influencing how you and I think, live, and organize our societies today.
Because that's the point of looking at this stuff, right?
Right. The mission for us today is to extract the ultimate aha moments from this massive stack of research. The historical translations, the geological surveys, the philosophical treatises.
There's a lot of material to cover.
There is. And we're distilling thousands of years of human progress into clear, interconnected insights. Because we don't just want to know the dates of when things happened. We want to understand the mechanics of it.
The why of it.
Yes, why this specific region on the planet became the cradle for some of the world's most profound societal advancements. Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the literal ground beneath our feet. Because the research makes a bold claim right out of the gate, which is that civilizations are the children of geography.
It's a really profound lens through which to view human development, actually.
How so?
Well, if you look at any major cradle of civilization, the environment is the invisible hand guiding everything. The culture, the economy, the religion.
Right.
You don't get the ancient Egyptians without the predictable, life-giving pulse of the Nile River, right?
Yeah.
And you don't get the maritime democratic explosions of ancient Greece without the fragmented islands and isolated coves of the Mediterranean Sea.
That makes sense.
And when we look at India, the geographical theater is so dramatic. It's so perfectly calibrated for incubating a massive civilization, it almost feels purposefully engineered.
Wow.
The subcontinent was shaped by four massive geographical pillars. You have the Himalayas to the north, the vast oceans acting as trade highways to the east, west, and south, the formidable Thar Desert acting as a shield, and then the incredibly fertile Ganga-Yamuna plains right in the middle.
I saw the mention of the tectonic history in the research, specifically this supercontinent called Gondwana. But I really want to understand how a shifting landmass actually creates a civilization.
Right, it seems disconnected.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Mount Everest today, and it just seems like this eternal, immovable fact of the Earth. But the geology shows that roughly 70 to 90 million years ago, this colossal landmass broke apart, and the piece we now call India started drifting northward toward Asia.
And that drift is the inciting incident for everything that follows.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. We are talking about a slow-motion geological drama The Indian plate was moving incredibly fast in geological terms, about 20 centimeters a year.
Which is flying for a continent.
Exactly. And when it finally collided with the Eurasian plate, it wasn't a gentle bump, it was a cataclysmic collision. The Earth's crust had nowhere to go but up.
Just smashing together.
Right. Seafloors were thrust into the stratosphere. I mean, you can actually find fossilized marine life, literally seashells, at the peak of Mount Everest today.
That is insane. Seashells on Everest.
Yeah. Yeah. But what's fascinating here is the sheer scale of the result. Because the Himalayas became much more than just a collection of very tall mountains. They became the ultimate climatic and military wall.
It's almost like the Gondwana tectonic collision was this massive slow-motion continental car crash.
That's a good way to put it.
And the crumple zone of that crash, where the metal bends and pushes upward, ends up becoming the tallest, most protective fortress wall in the world.
Yes.
The Earth smashes together, the hood crumples up into the sky, and suddenly everything sitting in the driver's seat behind that crumple zone is perfectly insulated and safe.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. And that crumple zone dictates the weather for billions of people even today.
How does it dictate the weather?
Well, the Himalayas are so high they actually dictate the atmospheric pressure. During the winter, they physically block the brutal freezing winds sweeping down from Siberia and the Central Asian steppes.
Oh, wow. I never thought about that.
Yeah, if those mountains weren't there, the Indian subcontinent would be a freezing, arid wasteland for half the year. Instead, it develops a relatively warm, stable, and hospitable climate.
Okay, so it keeps the cold out.
Exactly. And during the summer, they trap the monsoon clouds coming off the Indian Ocean. They force them to dump their moisture over the plains rather than just escaping into Central Asia.
So it's basically a giant irrigation system.
Yes. This creates an unparalleled agricultural engine. And on top of the climate, you have the military aspect. That wall served as a colossal barrier against early invasions.
Because nobody is marching an army over Everest.
Exactly. It gave whatever societies developed south of it the breathing room and the physical security to focus on things like engineering, philosophy, and urban planning, rather than just constant survival and warfare.
But a fortress, no matter how safe or how warm, is nothing without a water supply.
Right, you can't eat a wall.
Exactly, you can't farm without water. And that brings us to the rivers. The research highlights the rivers not just as features on a map, but as the literal churning lifeblood of the civilization.
Precisely. You cannot sustain a complex society without a reliable, massive source of fresh water. And the Himalayan runoff provided a perpetual supply. These rivers are the arteries.
So where do we start?
First, you have the Indus River, known originally in ancient times as the Sindhu.
Right.
This river is so fundamental that it gave the entire region its name. When the ancient Persians and later the Greeks encountered this civilization, they took the word Sindhu, adapted it to their own tongues, eventually becoming Indus, and from that, we get the name India.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Then you have the Ganga, or the Ganges. We are talking about a river over 2,500 kilometers long.
That is massive.
And the plains surrounding the Ganga and its tributary, the Yamuna, contain some of the deepest, most fertile alluvial soil on the planet. This is the soil that sustained continuous human habitation for millennia.
So this is what allowed cities to pop up.
Exactly, nurturing cities like Varanasi, which has been continually occupied for thousands of years and is still vibrating with life today.
And then there is the wild card. The river that I found absolutely mind-bending in the research. The Saraswati.
Ah, yes.
Because for generations, historians basically treated the Saraswati like a myth, didn't they?
They did. I mean, it was seen as purely symbolic.
Right. In the oldest ancient texts, specifically the Rig Veda, it is hailed as Naditama, which translates to the mother of rivers. The poets described it as this mighty roaring river that flowed from the mountains to the sea.
But if you look at a map today...
Exactly. If you look at a modern map of India, there is no massive Saraswati River. There's just the Thar Desert in that region. So for a long time, people just assumed it was a metaphor or like a mythical river of heaven.
Right.
But the modern research has completely flipped that narrative. How do satellites actually prove the existence of a 5,000-year-old poem?
It is an incredible convergence of modern technology and ancient literature. What geologists and hydrologists did was use remote sensing satellites like the Landsat imagery from NASA and ISR to scan the topography of the Rajasthan desert.
Okay, so they're looking from space.
Yes, and these satellites can penetrate the surface sand and detect variations in the soil, moisture, and subterranean structures.
Wow.
And what they found were massive paleochannels.
What's a paleochannel?
It's essentially the geological scar left behind by an ancient riverbed. They tracked this massive subterranean network running precisely where the ancient texts said the Saraswati flowed.
That is crazy.
It gets better. They even drilled down and found ancient, isotope-dated Himalayan glacial water trapped in the aquifers beneath the desert.
That is just staggering. You have a society writing poetry about a roaring river. The river eventually dries up and disappears under the sand, and 5 millennia later, we put a robot in orbit to prove the poets were telling the truth.
Exactly. The Saraswati wasn't a myth. It was a geographical reality. It was a massive perennial river that eventually shifted its course and dried up due to tectonic activity altering the slope of the land, combined with long-term climate change.
But when it was flowing,
In its prime, running parallel to the Indus, it provided an immense agricultural surplus, and that surplus is the key to everything.
because you have extra food.
Right. When you have fertile plains and constant water, one farmer can grow enough grain to feed 10 people. Those other 9 people are now freed from the daily, exhausting grind of just finding enough calories to survive.
That can specialize.
Yes, they can become brickmakers, metallurgists, city planners, and engineers.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the next massive revelation. Because this perfect geographical cradle didn't just support basic farming, it birthed an architectural miracle that completely breaks our standard timeline of human progress.
It really does.
And this brings us back to those railway workers in 1921, the accidental discovery of the Indus Valley Civilization.
Right.
Yeah, Harappa. And a year later, in 1922, the discovery of Mohenjo-Daro, which translates to the Mound of the Dead in the Sindh region. When archaeologists finally started excavating these sites properly, the timeline they uncovered was a total shocker.
It fundamentally shattered the Eurocentric view of ancient history. They dated these cities back to around 3500 BCE.
So that's roughly 5,500 years ago.
Yes. When we typically think of the ancient world, our minds go to Julius Caesar or maybe the philosophers of ancient Greece. But the Indus Valley Civilization predates the Roman Empire by thousands of years.
It's hard to even conceptualize that much time.
It is. It was contemporaneous with the very earliest dynasties of Egypt and the Sumerians in Mesopotamia. But what sets the Indus Valley apart isn't just its age. It is the sheer astonishing scale and sophistication of its urban planning.
This is what I want to dig into, because the research mentions grid system streets and standardized bricks, but I want to know how they actually pulled this off.
It's a logistical marvel.
Right. I mean, we are talking about a 5,500-year-old metropolis where the streets were laid out in perfectly straight lines, aligned exactly east to west and north to south. They had massive main avenues intersected by smaller residential alleys.
The grid system is the ultimate proof of a centralized mathematical society. It implies a culture that didn't just build organically.
What do you mean by organically?
Well, most ancient cities started as a small cluster of huts. And as the population grew, they just haphazardly added winding roads and alleys wherever they could fit them.
Like a maze.
Exactly. It resulted in chaotic, maze-like cities. But in Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, they clearly sat down, surveyed the empty land, calculated the wind directions because aligning streets east to west allowed the prevailing winds to naturally ventilate and cool the city.
Oh, that is so smart. Built-in air conditioning.
Exactly. And they mathematically planned the entire metropolis before they laid a single brick.
And speaking of the bricks, the research emphasizes that every single baked brick across this massive civilization followed a strict mathematical ratio, 4 to 2 to 1. Length, width, thickness.
Everywhere.
Yeah. It didn't matter if you were digging in Harappa in the north or hundreds of miles away in Mohenjo-Daro. How did a Bronze Age society manage to mass-produce standardized bricks on that scale without modern factories?
It requires an unbelievable level of logistical control. To achieve that 4.2.1 ratio universally, they couldn't just have families making bricks in their backyards. They had to have centralized, specialized guilds using standardized wooden molds.
Okay, so professional brick makers.
Yes. And they didn't just sun-dry these bricks like many other ancient cultures did.
Why not?
Because sun-dried bricks crumble in heavy rain. And remember, they lived in a monsoon floodplain. They had to fire these bricks in massive high-temperature kilns.
Which means they needed fuel.
A lot of it. They had to organize the logging of timber to fuel the kilns, manage the intense heat to bake the clay evenly, and then transport millions of these identical bricks across the city.
Just massive coordination.
And this 4.2.1 ratio isn't just a random choice. It is the optimal engineering ratio for bonding bricks together to build strong, load-bearing walls that won't easily collapse. They had cracked the code of structural engineering.
That blows my mind.
Yeah.
But honestly, the structural engineering is nothing compared to the plumbing.
Oh, the plumbing is legendary.
The research notes that these homes had covered underground drainage systems. They had attached bathrooms and toilets inside the individual houses 5,500 years ago.
Inside the houses, let that sink in.
Right. I was reading this and thinking about the fact that parts of 19th century London during the Victorian era were literally drowning in cholera because they had open sewers in the streets.
And people just throwing buckets out the window.
Exactly. And yet, here's a civilization in 3500 BCE with private indoor plumbing. How do their toilets and sewers actually work?
The plumbing mechanics are arguably their greatest achievement. Inside a typical Indus Valley house, the bathroom area was paved with specialized, tightly fitted, water-resistant bricks.
Oh.
The floor was deliberately sloped so that wastewater would flow into a small ceramic pipe. This pipe ran through the wall of the house and emptied into a larger street drain.
Okay, so it goes into the street.
Yeah.
But it's not open, right?
No, they didn't just let the waste flow openly in the streets. The street drains were fully enclosed, covered with specifically carved porous bricks that acted as manhole covers.
Manhole covers.
Yes, these covers could be lifted by municipal workers to clear out blockages. They even engineered soak pits and cesspools along the drainage lines to trap solid waste, allowing only the liquid waste to flow out of the city limits.
So they basically had a modern sewage filtration system.
They understood the mechanics of gravity flow, of managing sediment, and fundamentally they understood public sanitation.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Because you take that obsession with water and sanitation and you scale it up to the municipal level and you get the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro.
A masterpiece.
The research gives the dimensions. 11.88 meters long, 7.01 meters wide, and 2.43 meters deep. But again, they didn't just dig a big hole in the dirt. They engineered the world's first waterproof public pool.
Yes, and waterproofing a structure of that size in antiquity is an engineering marvel.
How did they do it?
They lined the floor and the sides of the bath with closely fitted bricks laid on edge. But to ensure water didn't seep through the mortar, they coated the entire structure with a thick layer of bitumen, which is a naturally occurring tar.
Oh, like asphalt.
Exactly. They essentially shrink-wrapped the pool in watertight asphalt. And to keep the water fresh, they had a massive adjacent well that supplied the water, and they engineered a huge corbelled drain, a meticulously arched brick tunnel to empty the bath when it needed cleaning.
So what was it for? Just a big swimming pool?
Most archaeologists believe this wasn't just a recreational swimming pool. Given the intense focus on cleanliness in their homes, this massive communal structure was likely designed for ritual purification.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
It suggests a society where physical cleanliness was deeply intertwined with their spiritual or civic identity.
And their civic identity was clearly driven by commerce. The research points out that they found standardized weights scattered across thousands of kilometers, from Harappa in the north all the way down to Lothal in the modern state of Gujarat.
Yes, Lothal.
And Lothal is fascinating because it's identified as the world's oldest known port. They had actual dockyards.
Lothal is a brilliant example of their applied science. They didn't just park boats on a beach. The engineers at Lothal built a massive trapezoidal basin of baked bricks that acted as a tidal lock.
A tidal lock. 5,000 years ago.
Yes. They understood the lunar cycles and the massive tidal variations of the Gulf of Khambhat. At high tide, ships could easily sail into this deep artificial basin, the gates would close, and the water would be trapped.
Wow, so the ships wouldn't just be stranded in the mud at low tide.
Exactly, keeping the ships afloat so they could be loaded and unloaded at the massive adjacent brick wharves. They were exporting cotton, timber, ivory, and meticulously crafted carnelian beads.
And they were trading with other major civilizations, right?
Oh, yes. We have hard archaeological evidence, specifically Indus Valley seals found in ancient Mesopotamian cities like Ur, proving they were engaging in massive international maritime trade.
Okay, so that trade brings us back to those standardized weights.
Yeah.
You cannot have a unified system of weights across thousands of kilometers unless you have some massive organizing force.
Sure.
A merchant in Lothal has to know that a merchant in Harappa is using the exact same measure for a pound of grain.
Exactly. They used shirtstone carved into perfect little cubes, and the math behind them is astounding.
Also,
They followed a binary system for the smaller weights, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, and a decimal system for the larger weights. You don't get that level of microscopic uniformity by accident. It requires a central authority enforcing economic standards.
right, and that implies a highly organized central government.
Yeah.
But here is my pushback, and this is the paradox that kept jumping out at me in the research.
Okay, let's hear it.
With these massive cities, the unified weights, the perfect grid systems, the incredible plumbing, there had to be an all-powerful king, right? An emperor. But the archaeologists haven't found a central palace.
That's right.
We haven't found a single monument to a definitive ruler. No giant statues of a king, no pharaoh's tomb, no golden throne room. If they had all this centralized control, where's the central controller?
That is the single most compelling mystery of the Indus Valley. When you look at their contemporaries, ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, what do you see? You see massive, crushing monuments dedicated to the ego of a single monarch.
Pyramids.
You see pyramids built on the backs of thousands of laborers. You see giant ziggurats. You see colossal stone reliefs of kings trampling their enemies. In the Indus Valley, you find none of that.
So what's the biggest building then?
The grandest structures we find are entirely civic. The Great Bath, massive ventilated granaries for storing the public food supply, the incredibly complex drainage systems. The immense resources of this society were heavily invested in civic infrastructure and public well-being rather than glorifying a single egotistical individual.
So were they just some massive peaceful co-op, a Bronze Age democracy?
It is entirely possible. The lack of royal palaces strongly points to a society that might have been governed by a council of elders, a powerful merchant guild, or perhaps an early form of democratic consensus,
Wow.
where the focus was on trade and civic harmony rather than military conquest. It forces modern historians to question the deeply held assumption that early human organization required a brutal, dictatorial king to enforce order.
We just assume you need a tyrant.
Right. But the Indus Valley suggests that early humans could organize themselves around mutual economic benefit and public health.
I love that. And you know what else supports that? The artifacts they actually did find.
The everyday objects.
Yeah. They didn't find caches of massive, terrifying weapons. They found art. They found the famous bronze dancing girl statue, which shows this incredibly sophisticated understanding of metallurgy and anatomy.
It's a beautiful piece.
And my absolute favorite detail? They found children's toys.
Yes, the toys are fascinating.
Little terracotta bullock carts with wheels that actually spin and mechanical birds that could whistle.
Yeah.
You picture society 5,500 years ago, and someone is taking the time to carefully craft a tiny, moving toy cart for a kid to play with in the courtyard of a house with indoor plumbing.
That's very sweet.
It just humanizes them so deeply. It takes them out of the realm of abstract history and makes them feel like our neighbors.
It paints a beautiful picture of a prosperous, stable, middle-class society. But as with all great ancient civilizations, we are left with two monumental, unsolved mysteries.
Okay, lay them on me.
The first is their voice, their language. Archaeologists have uncovered over 4,000 small, square, steatite seals.
These are the stamps they use for trade, right?
Yes. These seals are intricately carved with images of animals, bulls, elephants, and a lot of mysterious single-horned creatures that look like unicorns.
Unicorns.
Yeah, that's what they look like. But above those images is a distinct written script. But despite a century of intense effort, and even the modern application of massive supercomputers and AI pattern recognition, the Indus script remains completely undeciphered.
We literally don't know a single word they spoke.
Not one. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what their poetry sounded like, how they recorded their laws, or what their creation myths were.
It's almost haunting.
Until we find a bilingual artifact, like a Rosetta Stone, that translates their script into a known language like Sumerian, we are looking at a brilliantly silent civilization.
And the second mystery is the obvious one. What happened to them?
Right, the decline.
How does a society that advanced that widespread with that level of infrastructure just decline? You don't just forget how to build a sewer system.
No, you don't.
The research lists a few theories. Some suggest massive catastrophic floods from the Indus changing course. But the most compelling theory ties back to our earlier point about geography. the climate change, and the drying up of the mighty Saraswati River.
That is the leading scientific consensus. A metropolis needs a massive, continuous caloric surplus to function.
Yeah, to feed the people.
Exactly. The moment the rains fail or the river that sustains your agriculture shifts its course due to those tectonic movements we discussed, your cities simply cannot survive. The granaries empty, the drains dry up, and the population has to move.
So they didn't all just die out.
No, the crucial point the research makes is that the civilization didn't simply vanish into thin air. They didn't go extinct, and they weren't wiped out in some massive apocalyptic war. Modern DNA analysis, tracking genetic markers across generations, alongside archaeological tracking of pottery styles, shows a clear migration.
Where do they go?
As the climate shifted and the rivers dried, these populations slowly migrated. They moved south toward the Deccan Plateau and east toward the Ganga Basin. They eventually merged into the broader cultural and genetic fabric of the subcontinent, specifically contributing heavily to the Dravidian cultures of South India. The Indus Valley Civilization didn't end, it decentralized, and its people carried their agricultural and urban knowledge with them.
And that migration is the perfect organic bridge to our next major era. Because the decline of those massive grid-planned urban centers wasn't an endpoint. As those populations shifted, as the global climate continued to change, a completely new dynamic was introduced to the subcontinent.
A major paradigm shift.
A new group of people arrived, and the resulting cultural synthesis would literally write the book on human philosophy. Let's talk about the Aryan convergence and the birth of the Vedic mind.
This is a tremendously important section of the history, and it requires us to carefully navigate some very heavy and historically weaponized terminology.
Yes, we definitely need to talk about that.
Specifically, we need to address the true meaning of the word Arya. For a very long time, especially in the 20th century, this word has carried dark, horrific baggage. But the ancient texts themselves are very clear, and it is crucial we impartially report what the actual Sanskrit means.
Right, so what does it actually mean?
In Sanskrit, the word Arya simply means noble, superior in conduct, or honorable. It was a cultural and ethical descriptor. It was used to describe a lifestyle, a set of cultural practices, or a person of high moral standing.
So it's about behavior.
Exactly. It was unequivocally not a reference to a specific race, a bloodline, or a genetic group.
It's vital we clarify that, because the historical misuse of this term had devastating consequences for the entire world. The research explains that in the 19th century, certain European scholars, who were obsessively trying to categorize the world by race, took this ancient Sanskrit word and completely redefined it.
They twisted it.
They mutated a word meaning noble conduct into a pseudo-scientific racial category. And decades later, that false 19th century European definition was hijacked and twisted by Nazi ideology to justify horrific atrocities.
Exactly.
But modern genetics, modern linguistics, and modern archaeology have completely debunked that racial invasion theory. What the evidence actually shows is that around 2000 BCE, a group known to historians as the steppe pastoralists began migrating from Central Asia into the Indian subcontinent.
Yes, and understanding who these steppe pastoralists were is key. They were not a highly organized, uniformed army looking to conquer.
They weren't an invading force.
Right. They were nomadic, cattle-herding people living on the vast grasslands of Central Asia. And they were moving because pastoralists always move. They follow the seasons. They look for new grazing lands for the horses and cattle. And they adapt to climate fluctuations.
Makes sense.
As they slowly move through the mountain passes and into the fertile plains of the subcontinent, they naturally encountered the diverse populations that were already living there, including the descendants of the Indus Valley Civilization who had migrated eastward.
So what happened when they met?
What happened next wasn't a violent replacement. It was a slow, complex, and deeply organic process of cultural, linguistic, and genetic mixing.
I was trying to visualize this mixing, and it's almost like an ancient open source project.
Oh, I like that analogy.
You have the descendants of the Indus Valley people. They provide the hardware. They have the deep generational knowledge of the local agriculture. They understand the monsoon cycles. They have the legacy of urban living, the plumbing, the trade routes.
They know the land.
Right. Then the steppe pastoralists arrive, and they bring the software update. They bring a new, highly structured linguistic root system that will eventually evolve into Sanskrit. They bring the mobility of domesticated horses and chariots, and they bring a new pastoral culture centered around the reverence for nature, fire, and cattle.
It's a true merging.
Neither group wipes the other out. Instead, they merge their technologies, their vocabularies, and their worldviews to create a completely new operating system for society.
Yeah.
And that operating system is the Vedic civilization.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this open source collaboration resulted in a profound shift in what humanity focused on.
How so?
The Indus Valley Civilization left behind magnificent physical infrastructure, the baked bricks, the Great Bath, the subterranean plumbing. But the Vedic civilization, born from this synthesis, leaves behind almost no massive physical monuments.
Oh, really? No big temples?
They didn't build giant stone temples. Instead, they built massive monuments of the mind. They shifted the entire focus of society from the physical infrastructure of a city to the mental and spiritual infrastructure of human consciousness.
Wow.
And the ultimate enduring expression of that is the Rig Veda.
The Rig Veda. The research calls it the oldest known surviving text in the world. It contains 10,552 verses. But what amazed me is that it wasn't written down initially.
No, not for a long time.
It was transmitted entirely orally for centuries. How do you memorize over 10,000 verses of complex poetry without a book?
It requires an unbelievable mastery of acoustics and memory. The Vedic scholars developed incredibly complex mnemonic technique systems called pathas, where students would memorize the verses by chanting the words forward, then backward, then alternating in complex mathematical
That
patterns.
sounds incredibly difficult.
It was, but this ensured that not a single syllable, not a single tonal inflection was altered over hundreds of years. The preservation of the sound was considered as sacred as the meaning.
That's dedication.
And when you look at the meaning, it isn't just a ledger of kings or a list of rules. It is a staggering collection of poetry, natural observation, and profound philosophical inquiry.
The philosophical inquiry is what stopped me in my tracks. The research specifically highlights a section called the Nasadiya Sukta, which is the hymn of creation.
One of the most famous hymns.
I just want to read a translation of what this ancient text actually says, because it is mind-bending. It asks these impossibly deep questions about the exact moment the universe was created.
Go for it.
The lines are, neither non-being nor being existed. There was no air and no sky beyond it. What wrapped in its embrace? In whose protection? Was it water, unfathomable and deep?
It gives you chills when you really think about the context.
It really does.
You are looking at a society operating thousands of years ago, long before telescopes, long before theoretical physics or the Big Bang Theory, and they are standing under the night sky wrestling with the concept of absolute terrifying nothingness.
Asking the biggest possible questions.
They are asking questions that wouldn't look out of place in a modern quantum mechanics seminar. They are exploring the very boundaries of existence, wondering if the universe came from an intention or if it just spontaneously arose from a primordial void. And the Rig Veda was just the beginning.
Right.
It was the bedrock, the first of the four Vedas.
All right, the research breaks down the architecture of this knowledge. You have the Rig Veda, which contains the foundational hymns and the deep cosmic inquiries. Then you have the Samaveda, which is essentially the musical application.
The melodies.
Yeah, it took the mathematical hymns of the Rig Veda and set them to specific melodies and rhythms, effectively creating the foundation for all classical Indian music.
It's incredible.
Then the Yajur Veda, which was the manual for rituals, detailing the exact mechanics and geometry required to build fire altars.
Very precise geometry, too.
And finally, the Atharva Veda, which I found fascinating because it brings the lofty philosophy down to earth. It's the practical, everyday knowledge, things like early medicine, herbal remedies, spells for curing diseases, and managing daily agricultural life.
And out of this massive four-pillared bedrock of the Vedas emerged the Upanishads.
The Upanishads. Okay, let's talk about those.
If the Vedas are the foundation and the rituals, the Upanishads are the absolute zenith of this ancient philosophy. The word Upanishad literally translates to sitting down near, implying a student sitting closely to a teacher to receive esoteric knowledge.
Oh, like learning at the master's feet.
Exactly. The texts pull two specific quotes from the Upanishads that perfectly encapsulate their radically expansive worldview. The first is Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina, which translates to, may all beings be happy.
That's beautiful.
It is a universal declaration of empathy that transcends tribalism. It doesn't say, may just my tribe be happy or may just my kingdom be happy. It wishes well-being upon the entire fabric of life. The second is Aham Brahmasmi, which translates to I am Brahman or I am the universe.
I am the universe. That is such a heavy, beautiful concept. It implies that we aren't just sitting in the universe observing it. We are made of the exact same stuff.
It is a profound realization of non-duality. It is the idea that the individual soul, the Atman, and the ultimate infinite fabric of the cosmos, the Brahman, are not separate entities. They are fundamentally the same material.
It's a rejection of being isolated.
It is a philosophical rejection of isolation.
But they couldn't just sit around meditating on the cosmos all day, right? They had a society to run.
Right, they still had to farm and govern.
The research gives us a really clear picture of how this Vedic society actually operated on a day-to-day basis in the Sapta Sindhu, the region of the 7 rivers in the northwest. They had to organize their lives, and they did it through a very specific, highly structured psychological map. First, there was the ashrama system, which divided a human life into 4 distinct stages.
And the ashrama system is a remarkably healthy way to view human development, because it acknowledges that what you need and what you can contribute at age 20 is completely different from what you need at age 70.
That makes total sense.
The first stage is brahmacharya, the student phase, focused entirely on learning and building discipline. The second is grihastha, the householder phase, where you are expected to marry, accumulate wealth, raise a family, and be the economic engine of society.
So that's your productive working years.
Yes. The third is vanaprastha, the retirement or forest dweller phase, where you gradually hand over your responsibilities to the next generation and step back from material obsession. And finally, sannyasa, the ascetic phase, where you renounce worldly ties entirely to prepare for the end of life and spiritual liberation.
It's so balanced. It just makes room for every phase of life. And alongside those stages of life, they organize their labor through the Varna system.
This is another one we have to be very careful with.
Absolutely. Now, the research is very careful to clarify this, and it's an important distinction. In its original early Vedic conception, the Varna system was action-based, not birth-based.
Right.
It was essentially a division of labor based on an individual's natural aptitude and chosen profession.
Yes, it functioned much more like a guild system than a rigid caste hierarchy. You had the Brahmins, who were the scholars, teachers, and priests, the Kshatriyas, who were the administrators, politicians, and warriors, the Vaishyas, who managed commerce, agriculture, and trade, and the Shudras, who were the artisans, laborers, and service providers.
And people can move between them.
In the early Vedic period, there was mobility. A person born to a family of warriors could choose a life of scholarship and become a Brahmin. The crushing rigidity, the hereditary oppression, and the immobility that we associate with the caste system in later Indian history was a later corruption of this original, fluid, aptitude-based model.
It's so important to know the original context.
Yeah.
And speaking of the scholars, the education system that produced them was incredibly unique. They had the Gurukul system.
Forest schools.
Yeah. You didn't just go to a day school. You went and lived at the home of your teacher, your guru, in a forest ashram. You helped chop the wood, you tended the fires, and in exchange, you received an education. And the research notes that this education was entirely free.
Knowledge wasn't hoarded.
Exactly. But what really jumped out at me from the reading was the status of women in this early Vedic society. It was incredibly progressive. The text explicitly names several highly respected female scholars, women like Lopamudra, Ghosha, and Vishwavara.
Incredible figure.
These weren't just women who were allowed to read the hymns. They literally wrote some of the hymns in the Rig Veda.
The presence of these female scholars is a profound testament to the intellectual openness of the early Vedic period. Knowledge was viewed as a universal pursuit, and it goes beyond just writing poetry in private.
Right, they were out in public.
The research highlights philosophers like Maitreya and Gargi. Maitreya famously debated her husband, the great sage Yajnavalkya, arguing that she would rather have spiritual knowledge than all the material wealth in the world. And Gargi is legendary for participating in massive public philosophical tournaments.
Yeah, I read about Gargi.
Yeah.
Paint the scene for us because it sounds incredible.
Imagine the court of King Janaka. He has invited the greatest minds, the most powerful male sages from across the subcontinent to debate the nature of reality.
And there's a huge prize.
Yes, the prize is a massive herd of cattle with gold tied to their horns. And into this hyper-competitive, male-dominated arena steps Gargi Vachaknavi. She doesn't just watch. She stands up and fiercely debates the reigning champion sage, aggressively challenging him on the fundamental fabric of the cosmos, asking what the universe is woven from.
She just grills him.
She questions him so relentlessly that he eventually has to tell her to stop before her head falls off.
Oh my God.
Her participation wasn't seen as an anomaly, a joke, or an intrusion. She was respected and feared as a formidable intellect. The status of women during this specific era reflects a society that valued the capacity of the mind, regardless of gender.
That is just so cool. And as this society is pondering the cosmos and debating in public forums, their economy is evolving too. They started as a heavily pastoral society where the cow was the ultimate measure of wealth.
Hence the prize of cows with gold on their horns.
Right. The cow provided dairy, it helped plow the fields, it was the center of economic and ritual life. But as their population grew and their trade routes expanded eastward into the Ganga Plains, bartering cows became impractical.
Hard to carry a cow to the market.
Exactly. The research notes they transitioned to using a form of currency called the nishka, which were originally specific gold ornaments or necklaces that eventually became a standardized unit of trade.
And this economic transition is the catalyst for the next massive shift. As the society grows more economically complex, as territories expand, as kingdoms formalize their borders and resources become fiercely contested, the purely abstract philosophical questions asked in the Upanishads inevitably have to be applied to the brutal, muddy realities of human conflict, statecraft, and governance.
Philosophy meets the real world.
Exactly. You can ask, what is the universe, when you are sitting safely in a forest hermitage? But when two massive armies of cousins are facing each other over a piece of contested land, the question fundamentally changes.
It gets personal.
The question becomes, what is my duty? What is right and wrong in a world of violence? And that transition from abstract philosophy to applied morality leads us directly into the age of the great epics and the subsequent intellectual disruptors.
Which brings us to the massive, sprawling world of the epics. We were talking about the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And when we discuss these texts, we really have to grasp the sheer mind-boggling scale of the writing.
The scale's unprecedented.
The Ramayana contains 24,000 verses. That is a massive undertaking on its own, detailing the life of Rama, his exile, and the rescue of his wife Sita. But the Mahabharata contains 100,000 verses.
A library.
To put that in a Western context, the Mahabharata is roughly 8 times the size of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey combined. It is an entire, terrifyingly complex universe of text detailing a catastrophic civil war between two factions of a royal family, the Pandavas and the Kauravas.
The scale is intentional because the epics serve as the ultimate exhaustive case studies in human behavior.
Right, they cover everything.
The Mahabharata in particular is not a simple, sanitized story of good guys versus bad guys. It is a deeply uncomfortable web of family politics, gambling, betrayal, honor, and moral ambiguity. Every single character is flawed. Every decision has unforeseen, often tragic consequences.
But they're not just made-up stories, right?
Right. Before we dive purely into the psychology of the characters, we must acknowledge the physical, archaeological ties the research brings up regarding these epics. In partially reporting what the source texts outline, there are fascinating modern alignments.
What kind of alignments?
For example, archaeologists digging in North India have found evidence of a settlement in Hastinapur, which is the central contested capital city in the Mahabharata, and carbon dating puts that settlement right around 900 BCE, which aligns with the estimated historical time frame of the conflict.
Yeah, the archaeological alignments in the reading are really intriguing. They also report on marine archaeologists discovering an ancient submerged city underwater off the coast of Dwarka in Gujarat.
Which is Lord Krishna's city.
Exactly. This perfectly aligns with the epic's description of Lord Krishna's magnificent city ultimately being swallowed by the sea after the Great War. And they mention the Ram Setu, the legendary bridge described in the Ramayana that was built by an army of monkeys to connect India to Sri Lanka. The research notes that a massive chain of submerged limestone shoals is clearly visibly present in modern NASA satellite imagery, right exactly where the text says the bridge was built.
It's a striking visual alignment.
Now, the research presents these alignments to show how deeply intertwined the ancient geography and the epic narratives are. But I have to ask a question here. With texts as massive as the Mahabharata and with thousands of years of oral tradition before they were finally written down, is the line between literal history and myth even important anymore?
That's a great point.
I mean, doesn't the sheer psychological depth of the text make it a truce, regardless of whether the carbon dating of a piece of pottery matches up perfectly to the exact year of a chariot battle?
That is exactly the right question to ask, and it is the perspective the deepest thinkers eventually adopt. Whether every single chariot wheel or arrow is archaeologically verified is secondary to the text's primary function as a moral compass. The epics are an investigation into dharma, righteous duty, and cosmic law. And the absolute pinnacle of this investigation is the Bhagavad Gita. The Gita is a 700-verse philosophical dialogue embedded right in the chaotic center of the Mahabharata.
Right in the middle.
And the setting of this dialogue is crucial to understanding its power. It does not take place in a serene temple or a quiet ashram or a mountaintop. It takes place in the exact center of a battlefield, Kurukshetra, in the fleeting moments right before a catastrophic war is about to begin.
Right. The war horns have been blown, the arrows are about to fly, and the greatest warrior of his age, Arjuna, has his chariot driven into the middle of the two armies. He looks across the battlefield, and he doesn't just see a faceless enemy.
No, he sees his family.
He sees his own teachers, his grandfathers, his friends, and his cousins in the opposing army. And he breaks down. He drops his weapons. He suffers a profound moral crisis and essentially says to his charioteer, "I cannot kill my family for a piece of land. The cost to my soul is too high. I would rather let them kill me."
It is the ultimate panic attack happening at the worst possible moment. He is paralyzed by the horror of the action he is required to take. And his charioteer happens to be the deity Krishna in human form.
Which is quite the chariot driver to have.
Very handy. Krishna then has to essentially freeze time and explain the fundamental nature of reality, life, death, and duty to Arjuna. The core message that Krishna delivers, the psychological tool that the Gita provides, is the philosophy of detached action. Krishna tells him, do your duty without attachment to the results.
Do your duty without attachment to the results. It sounds simple, but it is incredibly difficult to execute.
It is incredibly difficult because it goes against our human nature. We usually act because we want a specific result. We want wealth or praise or victory.
Right, we want a payoff.
But Krishna argues that if your mind is obsessed with the anxiety of winning or the fear of losing, you cannot perform your action purely. You must do what is morally right. You must fulfill your obligation to society and to justice simply because it is the right thing to do. You just do the work because the work must be done, and you surrender the outcome to the universe.
The psychological resonance of that idea is staggering. And the research mentions a brilliant modern example of how timeless this text is. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist who directed the Manhattan Project, famously taught himself Sanskrit just so he could read the Bhagavad Gita in its original form.
Yes.
And after witnessing the Trinity test in 1945, the first successful detonation of an atomic bomb, Oppenheimer recalled a specific line from the Gita. It's the moment where Krishna reveals his terrifying infinite cosmic form to Arjuna to prove the inevitability of time. And Krishna says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
It is a chilling and perfect illustration of how these ancient texts are not bound by antiquity. Think about it. Oppenheimer, in 1945, a modern scientist experiencing the absolute extreme of human technological terror, holding the power to end civilization in his hands, feeling an incomprehensible burden of moral responsibility.
And he turns to the Gita.
And to process what he was feeling, he reached back over 2,000 years to a chariot on an ancient Indian battlefield to find the vocabulary. The epics functioned as the operating system for societal morality. They provided the framework for understanding duty.
Right.
But as with any complex society, that operating system occasionally gets bloated, it develops bugs, the hierarchies become too rigid. And this raises an important question. What happens when a society's religious rituals become so complex, so expensive, and so controlled by an elite few that the average person is completely left behind?
They rebel. And that is exactly what happened around 500 BCE. The research describes this era as the age of the great disruptors.
The reform.
Right. The Vedic traditions, which had started out so fluid and philosophical, had over centuries become heavily bogged down. The focus had shifted away from the beautiful cosmic inquiries of the Upanishads and towards incredibly complex rituals. The Brahmin priestly class held a monopoly on these rituals, and the ceremonies increasingly required massive animal sacrifices.
It became highly exclusive.
It became an elite club that was economically and spiritually draining the general population. And out of this highly polarized environment, two monumental intellectual revolutions emerged almost simultaneously: Buddhism and Jainism.
And what makes these movements so fascinating is that they were internal disruptions. You have Siddhartha Gautama, who would become the Buddha, and Vardhamana Mahavira, the 24th Tirthankara of
They
Jainism.
were insiders.
Neither of these men came from outside the culture to destroy it. They were both born deep inside the system specifically. They were both born into wealthy, powerful kshatriya or noble warrior families. Siddhartha was a prince living in immense luxury.
He had everything.
But both men, independently, looked at the rigid, highly ritualized, suffering-filled society around them, and they walked away from their palaces. They went into the forests to find a different answer. And what they emerged with were radical, deeply democratic premises that challenged the ultimate authority of the Vedas.
I want to really dig into the mechanics of what they were proposing because they essentially cut out the theological middleman.
Yes.
They looked at the people and said, enlightenment, spiritual liberation, breaking the cycle of rebirth, none of this comes from the expensive fire rituals a Brahmin priest performs on your behalf. And it certainly doesn't come from the social class or caste you were arbitrarily born into.
Yeah.
It comes entirely from your own personal actions, your own self-discipline, your own moral compass.
They democratized enlightenment. They argued that a person's worth is determined by their karma, their intentional actions, not their birth. Furthermore, both movements vehemently championed the concept of ahimsa, or absolute nonviolence.
Which was a big deal.
Now, ahimsa wasn't just a nice moral idea. It was a radical, direct economic and social challenge to the establishment. By preaching absolute nonviolence toward all living beings, they were directly invalidating the massive animal sacrifices that the Brahmins relied upon for their power and rituals.
Wow, so it's a direct hit to the system.
Exactly. Jainism, under Mahavira, took this to an extraordinary level of asceticism. Jain monks would sweep the path in front of them so they wouldn't accidentally step on an insect, and they wore masks so they wouldn't inhale a fly. It was a profound commitment to causing zero harm in the universe.
And Buddhism offered a slightly different approach, which the research calls the middle way. Siddhartha Gautama tried the extreme asceticism, starving himself until he was nearly dead, and realized that torturing the body didn't free the mind.
It just weakened you.
So he found a balance, and he laid out this incredibly practical system called the Eightfold Path. The reading breaks down this path, and it honestly reads less like ancient mysticism and more like a modern cognitive behavioral therapy manual.
It is entirely psychological. The Buddha realized that human suffering is fundamentally caused by attachment and craving. To eliminate the suffering, you have to rewire how your mind processes the world. The Eightfold Path is the practical toolkit for that rewiring.
What are the steps?
It includes steps like right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Notice the repetition of the word right.
Yeah, right everything.
It is about ethical, mindful precision in everything you do. Before you speak, you analyze your intention. Is it true? Is it helpful? Is it kind? If not, you remain silent. It is a rigorous, daily, moment-to-moment practice of self-awareness.
It's a completely self-reliant philosophy. You don't need a temple, you don't need money, you just need your own mind. And the fact that Buddhism and Jainism were allowed to flourish, that they could openly challenge the dominant Vedic religion without being violently exterminated, proves something incredible about ancient Indian culture.
It really does.
It wasn't a stagnant dictatorial pool of dogmatic beliefs. It was a culture that was highly dynamic. It was constantly questioning itself, debating its own rules in public courts, and spawning massive intellectual revolutions that would eventually spread across the Himalayas and influence the entire globe.
It is a true testament to the intellectual fertility of the region. Just as the massive, silt-rich plains of the Ganga River produced a massive agricultural surplus that allowed cities to grow, the open, debating environment of the society produced a massive intellectual surplus. They were rigorously, fearlessly workshopping the human condition from every possible angle, from the deeply ritualistic to the purely ascetic, from the duties of a warrior to the absolute nonviolence of a monk.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive by looking at an archaeologist stopping a railway crew in the 1920s. We then watched massive tectonic plates, pieces of the supercontinent Gondwana smash into Asia to form the Himalayas, a colossal protective crumple zone that allowed a unique civilization to safely incubate. We traced the mighty rivers that sustained life, and we used satellites to track the ghost of the ancient Saraswati River. We dug into the baked dirt of the Indus Valley and found a 5,500-year-old metropolis with perfectly planned grid systems, mathematically standardized bricks, and covered indoor plumbing that completely upended our modern arrogance about ancient urban planning.
We then explored the beautiful, complex cultural synthesis of the migrating steppe pastoralists and the descendants of the Indus Valley. We saw how this blending coded a new operating system for the Vedic era, moving the human focus from physical bricks to the monumental quantum-level philosophy of the Upanishads. We saw female scholars fiercely debating the cosmos, and a society thoughtfully organizing itself around the psychological stages of a human life.
It's just so much innovation.
And finally, we witnessed the immense, overwhelming scale of the epic age, where the Bhagavad Gita provided a timeless, profound manual for action in the face of despair. And the brilliant disruptions of Buddhism and Jainism proved that true enlightenment requires constant questioning, personal accountability, and reform.
Exactly. And the ultimate takeaway here, that the reason we actually do these deep dives for you, the listener, is to realize that being truly well-informed changes your perspective on the present moment. It means recognizing that our modern, incredibly stressful debates about how to build a fair society, how to design sustainable urban infrastructure, or how to maintain a personal moral compass in a violent, chaotic world. None of these are new problems.
No, not at all.
They aren't unique to the 21st century. They were being rigorously, beautifully workshopped 5,000 years ago on the banks of the Indus and the Ganga. We are not starting from scratch. We are just participating in the latest chapter of a very old, very profound conversation.
It is deeply humbling and yet incredibly empowering to realize we are part of that continuum.
Yeah,
The same questions that kept an ancient sage awake at night are the same questions that keep us awake today.
it really is. And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, a little thought experiment to take with you. We talked at length about the great unsolved mystery of the Indus Valley Civilization, their completely undeciphered script.
Those 4,000 seals.
Right. 4,000 carved seals holding the silent, locked language of a society with perfect plumbing, unified weights, and no dictator's palaces. Imagine if tomorrow morning a linguist or a massive AI model finally cracks that code. What do you think we will find in those translations?
It's a fun thought.
Will we find profound, sweeping spiritual poetry that rivals the creation hymns of the Rig Veda? Or will we just find incredibly mundane bureaucratic tax receipts, grain inventories, and a list of angry complaints to the city council about a blocked street sewer drain? And honestly, if it turns out to be nothing but complaints about the plumbing, wouldn't that make us feel even more intimately connected to these ancient people? Think about it. Until next time, keep diving deep.